Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church in Columbia, South Carolina, where we're part of the ELCA. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. In the days before the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther was beginning to have some doubts about some of the traditions he had been taught, and especially by the corruption of the priests that he witnessed. About that time, he went on a pilgrimage to Rome. There he took part in a ceremony where he climbed some stairs on his hands and knees, kissing each step. This was supposed to earn an indulgence and reduce his grandfather's time in purgatory. The story goes that as Luther finished on the top step, he stood and said, "Who knows if it is so?" Even worse, he saw priests, many of them, celebrating communion masses for the people in the town square, but making a mockery of them. As they consecrated the bread, they were saying in Latin, "Bread thou art, and bread thou shalt remain," instead of speaking of Christ in the meal. The lay people didn't know Latin, so they didn't know what these priests were saying. Luther did, and he was incensed at the corruption. This week we are making our way through the small book of Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament. In many ways, it could have been written today. In many ways, it could have been written to us. Let me give you a little background. Priests in the temple were called to sacrifice for the people, and there were plenty of rules about that. Not only were there certain animals used for certain sacrifices, but even more, the animals were supposed to be without blemish. In other words, perfect. What that meant was that you were supposed to give God your best, not your leftovers or rejects. That's what the word sacrifice means. You give up something valuable to you because of something even more valuable to you. Giving honor to God is more important than the monetary value of an unblemished animal. We are to honor God by giving God our best. Let me remind you that the book of Malachi is set up like a lawsuit, and God is the one being sued. They have accused God of not being faithful to the covenant and abandoning them. Yesterday we saw how God answered by showing them that they had been restored to their land and that God was still with them. Then God makes a counterclaim against them, and in particular about the priests. "Look at you," God says through Malachi. "You have despised my name and polluted your sacrifices." When the priests answer, "How?" God points out how they are using second-rate animals for the sacrifices and keeping the best for themselves. It's a lot like those priests Luther encountered when they were paying God lip service. Their sacrifices had no meaning to them. They were not honoring God in their worship, but instead giving God the leftovers. True faith and understanding and relationship with God come through the stories of old, how God has acted in the past and how we can count on God to act in the future, and through authentic, meaningful worship. In Malachi, God accuses them of having worship that is perfunctory. Their gifts cost them nothing, so there's really no sacrifice involved, and their worship has become a tiresome or sleepy duty. You come and go through the motions, but your hearts are far from me, God tells them. In modern terms, they mail it in. Now, God isn't concerned with ritual here, but with honor. God is to be given glory, and our worship is to be our true response to God in our lives. Our worship should be marked by reverence, honor, obedience, and love. They are the ones who have abandoned the covenant, not God. They have polluted what sacrifices are supposed to be about, and now God says they will be the ones cursed and polluted. A fact you might not ever have thought about is that with all the animals going in alive for sacrifices, on occasion they would drop dung that needed to be removed from the temple. God tells those priests, just as they have ejected that dung, they will be ejected in the same way. They have despised God, and now they will be despised. The case has turned. Who is on trial now? Yet even then, God's verdict involves an expression of God's love. God continues to care for them. God seeks reform for them and to make them God's own again. Jesus made a similar point as Malachi here in an action that may confuse us. If you remember the story, Jesus is on the Mount of Olives on the way to the temple when he sees a fig tree in full leaf and looking fine and healthy. Yet when he goes over to the tree, there are no figs, and Jesus curses the fig tree. It confuses us because that seems so un-Jesus-like. Later that day, as they head back out of Jerusalem, they find that the fig tree has withered. Well, that story isn't about Jesus being hungry and frustrated at no figs. You see, the Mount of Olives is just across the valley from the temple, and what Jesus did was a symbolic action to say, just as this fig tree looks good on the outside but isn't bearing fruit, just so that temple over there looks great, but it isn't bearing the fruit of faith. It will wither away, just like this fig tree. It's barren and dead. Maybe this is a good time to ask ourselves about our own gifts to God. So often I hear that we contribute to God what we can afford. But if that's what we're doing, there's no sacrifice there. Remember, a sacrifice happens when we give up something valuable to us because of the surpassing value of God to us. Maybe we should consider prayerfully our response to all God does in our lives. May our hearts be true. May we give God all honor and glory always. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.